A number of years ago, my wife and I, along with another church member couple, had the opportunity to spend a week on the island of Aruba, which is 17 miles off the coast of Venezuela. We were there on a Sabbath, and we had a very relaxing Sabbath day on that trip, sunbathing on white sand beach, reading the Bible and talking about that as we relaxed on the beach, a little bit of snorkeling as well. And it was just a very, very relaxing and very enjoyable and refreshing Sabbath. But we did find ourselves wishing that there was a church and some brethren on the island that we could fellowship with and spend a little bit of time, but there was only the four of us as far as members of the church. And it was either on the trip home from that vacation or not long after on another trip flying somewhere that I came across a magazine article. And some of you may remember a magazine called Hemisphere. It was the magazine of United Airlines that was available on all the planes. In the pocket on the back of the seat, they had Hemisphere magazine. And the article, as I paged through it, that caught my eye was an article titled Ancient Wisdom. So I began reading the article, and this is how the article began. If you and your family are drowning in a sea of to-do lists, try doing nothing for one day each week. Interesting. It again caught my attention right away. I found out that the author of this article formerly had grown up practicing the Jewish faith. She had an Orthodox Jewish understanding of the Sabbath. But I found as I read on through the article, which was about the Sabbath, that she approached it from a different perspective than other things I had read about the Sabbath or from sermons I had given about the Sabbath in the past. She really did approach it from a totally different perspective and shared a principle that I would just refer to as the side benefits of keeping God's Sabbath holy. Ancient Wisdom, again, the title of the article, and it was all really about side benefits of keeping God's Sabbath holy. Now, we understand and believe that we usually talk about two aspects of observing the Sabbath, physical and spiritual, and certainly those are there. But this article I found discussed additional facets, other blessings that come from keeping the Sabbath. And they had to do a lot with mental and emotional frame of mind and attitude about the Sabbath that I found is a great part of what we learn by experience from observing the Sabbath. So again, from a different perspective. Now, the Sabbath is a belief we hold very deeply. It's a doctrine of God's church. And for us in the Church of God, much of what we do during the week often centers around preparing for the Sabbath. And in a sense, the week revolves around the Sabbath and getting ready for the Sabbath and aiming for the Sabbath. And again, there are beliefs related to the Sabbath that we hold very dear. We know that the Sabbath is a symbol of rest, that there is a physical rest involved, and it's a symbol of a spiritual rest. We understand its meaning for the future, a picture of the millennium, and we look forward to that. But in a sense, most of all, the Sabbath is a way of life. It has become a way of life for all of us, just as Christianity is a way of life. And it pays some dividends that we really may not have thought of or reflected on in the past. So I thought we'd look at the Sabbath from mental or physical and spiritual, but also mental, emotional aspects of the Sabbath, as well as the physical and spiritual. And a little bit later on, I'm going to read in its entirety. It's not a long article, but the article Ancient Wisdom, and show you what this family learned as they began or resumed keeping the Sabbath, which they hadn't done for many years. But let's begin by going back to Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2. And let's read here in verses 1 and 2. Genesis 2, verses 1 and 2. We are familiar with the statement where we read that God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. So the evening and the morning were the sixth day. Verse 2, thus the heavens and the earth and all the hosts of them were finished. Chapter 2, verse 1, and then verse 2, and on the seventh day God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Now, through the years, perhaps you have, as I have, had discussion with some who have argued against the Sabbath being something we need to observe today. And occasionally I would hear remarks kind of, I guess you could say in a sarcastic way, well, was God tired? Was he overworked by creating? And in their comments, they don't understand the importance of what God just did in creating for 6 days, laboring and doing all of that work, and then stopping. From the time the sun goes down at the end of the sixth day and the beginning of the seventh day, and resting until the end of the seventh day. He rested, it says, on the Sabbath day from his work which he had made. So we're told that God rested, setting an example for all mankind. And when you think about it, if the God of this universe, the God who exists by this very act has shown us something, it's the fact that when he rested, he really did rest. He means exactly what he said. He wasn't tired. He wasn't weary or worn out from creating, but he simply set us an example in a specific way that is important. And we'll explore that more as we go along. Verse 3, then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. Now, we understand that God's Sabbath is a gift that has been bestowed on mankind. First, we understand that he rested, as it says here, setting us an example. Second, it says that he blessed the Sabbath. It's from the Hebrew word that means to kneel as an act of worship. Now, we don't worship the Sabbath, as some have said, but on the Sabbath, we worship the God who created the Sabbath. We're here to worship God on the Sabbath in our homes as we pray, as we study, as we draw closer to God by keeping the Sabbath, by resting, by following his other commands. It's all part of how we worship God on the Sabbath day. And so he blessed it. Again, to kneel as an act of worship is the literal meaning of that word. And third, we understand from this verse that God sanctified the Sabbath. That is, he established it as holy time, set apart, different from the other days of the week, and only God can make something holy. He says he made this 24-hour period of time holy time. The Bible tells us that keeping the Sabbath is an act of worship so holy that its desecrating the Sabbath was considered by God to be a great sin if we desecrate the Sabbath. And he put such emphasis on it and importance on the Sabbath that the week should revolve around preparing for the Sabbath and looking forward to the Sabbath that we set apart from the rest of the week. But let's go to Exodus chapter 20, where we find a list of the Ten Commandments. And notice the description here in Exodus 20 of the Sabbath command. Exodus chapter 20. Remember how it begins in verse 8 with a word that is important to take note of. Exodus 20 and verse 8, which reads, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. There's something important about remembrance as it applies to the Sabbath, but to others of God's laws as well. Remembrance is an important part in the development of our relationship with God on the Sabbath day, and of course other times of the week as well. But especially on the Sabbath day, remembrance is an important part of how we strengthen and develop our relationship with God. We plan for the Sabbath. We prepare for it. The Sabbath is imprinted on our minds and in our lives, something that we anticipate, that we look forward to, that we delight in. Maybe we recall and we reminisce. I know I often find myself reminiscing about my first Sabbath when I was first learning about the Sabbath. and the journey for my life since then and where it's taken me, beginning by learning about God's Sabbath. That's where I began looking for the true church, to find a Sabbath-keeping church, finding that in the Bible that's what God's church would be. And I often reminisce and think about where my relationship with God has come through the years. And so God has to say, remember, because mankind has forgotten so much of what God gives. So much of what's in the Bible, mankind has simply forgotten. Doesn't remember very much of it at all. And when it comes to the Sabbath and other things, God says, remember the Sabbath day. And notice verse 9. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. Two aspects of working are mentioned here. One is labor. The other is work. What's the difference? We labor and we work. We do a lot of labor when we're working at our particular job, our occupation. We labor at that, but then there are other things that we do outside of that we work at. Our home, our car, our yard, paying the bills, other kinds of work that we do, hobbies, family-related chores and jobs that we all have, that is a part of all of our lives. The point is, God says here we should labor and do all of these things, our work, in 6 days and then rest on the Sabbath. And the principle behind it is to remove ourselves from those things, to remove ourselves physically, and that takes us away mentally as well, and perhaps emotionally in some cases, to remove ourselves from these things and from all the labor and all the work that we normally do, to just take ourselves out of that for a day, because there are some very important benefits that come from that. And then verses 10 and 11. Verse 10 and 11, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth. So God takes us back to creation in this command, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So this fourth commandment then harkens back to creation when God blessed and hallowed the Sabbath. Something important and good for all mankind, not just for one tribe of Israel, but for the whole human family. We find in Mark 2 then, Christ emphasized that very thing. Let's go back to Mark chapter 2 and begin in verse 23. Because the context of what's going on here, I think, is important. Mark chapter 2, and beginning in verse 23, and notice what was going on when Christ made this statement about the Sabbath in Mark chapter 2. Beginning in verse 23. Now it happened that he, Christ, went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. And as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath? But he said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priests, and also gave some to those who are with him. So here Christ is dealing with the Pharisees and the problem of some of their rituals and regulations and the challenges that could create. In this case, the problem of taking care of certain physical needs on the Sabbath. And he said to them, following that statement in verse 27, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. So we learn that from Christ's point of view, in this case, there was no problem with what the Old Testament scriptures said about the Sabbath compared to what he and his disciples were doing in this case. That there was not a problem in this case because the Sabbath, he said, was made for man. But some used this example to say that Christ, what he did on the Sabbath was breaking the Sabbath, and that Christ himself violated the Sabbath. And of course, they try to support the need for no longer keeping the Sabbath, showing that Christ made the Sabbath of none effect. Of course, that's not what he was doing. His point was, Christ was showing that there could be a misuse of the Sabbath, boxing man in so strictly and so tightly with regards to the Sabbath as the Pharisees did, with their many regulations and stipulations about how the Sabbath was to be kept, detailed regulations. Christ said that there was a misuse of the Sabbath and would end up making it a burden so that men wouldn't be able to use it as God intended. And so he said the Sabbath was made for man. So God intended this 24-hour period of time to be a time when we worship God. We could spend extra time building and strengthening our relationship with God, that we would have some extra time because we rest from our labor and rest from all of our work to strengthen and build our relationship with God, and to go into the Sabbath with a certain attitude and to develop that attitude through the years as we continue to observe God's Sabbath day. What attitude is that? Again, we'll go on and see more what the Bible says about that. We use the Sabbath to rest physically and to grow spiritually as God intended. So let's go back to Exodus 23. What kind of attitude do we go into the Sabbath with? What kind of attitude do we develop in the Sabbath? Well, we've seen we do a certain amount of resting. But there's an interesting word here in Exodus 23 and in Exodus 31. But Exodus 23, verse 12. Again, a statement about the Sabbath. Exodus 23, verse 12. 6 days you shall do your work, and on the seventh day you shall rest, that your ox, your donkey may rest, and the son of your female servant and the stranger may be refreshed. May be refreshed. The Hebrew word translated here, refreshed, is from the Greek word nephash, close to nephesh, but this word simply means to breathe. Like someone who takes a deep breath, just, whew, glad that's over with. To breathe is what the word literally means. We all do that at various times. We're going along doing something all wrapped up in some time, and we just stop and take a deep breath, and it kind of refreshes us, energizes us. We use the phrase that was like a breath of fresh air because it has refreshed us. Or we see it, there's an opportunity to just kind of rest and relax by taking that deep breath. Some translations say new-souled as well as refreshed. And notice in Exodus 31, it's interesting that this same statement is found applying to God and the Sabbath. Exodus 31, verse 16 and 17. Verse 16, therefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. There's that word again, that God himself was refreshed. Literally, the word means to breathe oneself or to draw breath. It's a relaxation concept. The idea being to have a change of pace that is so different that allows us to let go of certain things and to just relax. Like, men, if you remember your first speech in Spokesman's Club, after you sat down after giving that speech, it was just, whew, I'm glad that's done with and over with. Or teens giving their first speech in Teen Club, whew, I'm glad that's over with. You just kind of let go and relax. It helps you to kind of have new life, to be refreshed. And that's the meaning behind this word. And the Sabbath, when we observe it in all of its aspects, gives the opportunity for human beings to have spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical batteries kind of recharged or refreshed, is what it's designed to do. And when you find basic principles like this in the Bible, spiritual principles, often there are physical side benefits that go with it. And this attitude of the Sabbath is refreshing. I look forward to the Sabbath because all that happens during the week and all the pressures and stresses of the week and all the going this and doing that, I'm looking forward to being refreshed. It's a breath of fresh air. It's, whew, the Sabbath is here. And we go into the Sabbath with that attitude, and that attitude grows through the years as we faithfully observe God's Sabbath day. Some of you may have heard the name Norman Cousins. Norman Cousins has an interesting story to tell. He was editor for 35 years of Saturday Review magazine. He also was a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, Biobehavioral Sciences, in the School of Medicine at UCLA. He's the author of more than a dozen books, including a book called Anatomy of an Illness and The Healing Heart, Antidotes to Panic and Helplessness. He studied the subject of psychiatry, biobehavioral science, emotions, health in depth. And here's a quote from an article about him that was in a newspaper a while back. Cousins, quoting the article, is the author of Anatomy of an Illness, the best-selling account of his mid-1960s bout with a crippling disease called ankylosing spondylitis, from which he was given a 1 in 500 chance of full recovery. Some people eventually become severely disabled as a result of the bones in their spine fusing in a fixed position and damage to other joints such as the hips or knees. This is what he was suffering from. Cousins actively participated in the treatment of that illness, refusing pain-killing medication as well as other standard medical procedures. In their place, of all things, he substituted laughter, vitamin C, and an overwhelming will to live with spectacular results. His mobility returned. He was eventually able to discard the metal braces he wore on his knees and his body, once so poisoned with pain that sleep was impossible, became virtually pain-free. His laughter treatment, the article goes on to say, of all things, he got copies of old candid camera television programs and would watch hour after hour of candid camera. And he would read written humor, humorous stories, and humorous jokes. And it's interesting because he used a similar treatment to recover from a heart attack that he had as well. Maybe it wouldn't work for everybody. For him, it worked. But what he found was that by getting away from the rat race of life, as it was for him at that time, and the stresses, and by doing this kind of treatment to get his mind off the normal pace of things, that there were physical changes in his body and in his hormones, and that promoted healing. And he recovered from his disease. He took on a different frame of mind by doing these things, and it created a lot of benefits for his body. Again, the Sabbath does a similar thing, not necessarily in healing diseases. It's not a sermon about healing. But the Sabbath does similar things in the sense there are also physical benefits from obeying a spiritual principle. In this case, the Sabbath, that many people don't understand, that get overlooked, and yet God in his wisdom knew that the human body needs what the Sabbath provides, and that there are those physical benefits as well as spiritual benefits. Even, as far as what we're doing affecting our attitude, affecting us physically. There are principles, for example, Proverbs 3. Proverbs 3, verse 5 through 8. How do we know that obeying certain spiritual principles also has physical benefits? Proverbs 3, verse 5 through 8, for example. Proverbs 3, verse 5, trust in the Lord with all your heart. An important spiritual principle. Lean not on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. In all of our ways, how we live our life, we acknowledge God. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. It will be health to your flesh and strength to your bones. Departing from evil, fearing God, obeying His 10 commandments, obeying His laws, spiritual principles can be health to your flesh and strength to your bones. In the case of the Sabbath, moving away from the worries of life that may have upset us during the week, that maybe have set us back during the week emotionally, even physically, and going into the Sabbath, relaxing, being refreshed, putting those situations that are beyond our control in God's hands, taking that to God in prayer, especially on the Sabbath, all of that promotes health, spiritually as well as physically, mentally, and emotionally. Positive things, God says, occur when we can do that. So, with the Sabbath then, there are side benefits of observing God's Sabbath as He intended for us to observe it. If you turn over a page to Proverbs 4, notice verse 20 through 22. Proverbs chapter 4. My son, give attention to my words. Incline your ear to my sayings. Do not let them depart from your eyes. Keep them in the midst of your heart, for they are life to those who find them, and health to all their flesh. Again, physical health is affected by our attitude, by our mental frame of mind, by our emotional state. All of that also affects our health. Norman Cousins wrote about an incident he observed that I think reinforces this. This is what he wrote. It was in an article he wrote, What You Believe and Feel Can Have an Effect on Your Health. He said emotions play a profound part in bringing on disease and in helping combat it. What you think, what you believe, how you react to experiences can impair or aid the workings of the body's immune system. I was told at a convention of anesthesiologists of an episode at a southern hospital where they discovered a sudden outcropping of heart arrests under anesthesia. This was mystifying because the hospital had a very low record of fatalities in connection with anesthesia. The hospital tracked down the fatalities to 2 anesthesiologists and discovered that the patients were informed of the risks of anesthesia just before surgery. Just before they went into surgery. If you've had surgery, you sign things that say this could kill you, you may die from this procedure, but that's before, that's not just moments before you go into surgery. But here, these 2 anesthesiologists were reminding patients about, well, there are these risks and you could die just before they went into surgery. Even though the patients were not conscious, their subconscious carried a terrible burden of apprehension that in combination with the effects of the anesthesia pushed the impact on the body beyond tolerable limits. And he said what you believe and feel even subconsciously can have an effect on your health. So again, this isn't a sermon about health, but the Sabbath provides a renewing, a resouling, a recharging, a refreshing that can affect physically, mentally, emotionally, our health, as well as spiritually. The Sabbath gives us the ability, spiritually speaking, to draw a breath, relax, and be refreshed. And God intends for us to have that attitude going into the Sabbath and in keeping the Sabbath, and that's something that grows within us, that understanding and that desire for God's Sabbath that helps us truly delight in the Sabbath. Let's go back to Luke chapter 5. Christ's own example. Now this doesn't specifically relate or say the Sabbath, but I would surmise that occasions like this were included on the Sabbath. We read this statement in Luke 5 and verse 16 about something that Christ did often. Luke 5 verse 16, so he himself often withdrew into the wilderness and prayed. Christ often withdrew into the wilderness and prayed. Probably reminded his disciples of the need to get away from the crowds at times, from the stresses, from the pressure, And certainly he did things on the Sabbath with crowds around, like healing, and preaching a message, but he often also withdrew. And probably many of those times on the Sabbath to relax, to get away, to let things settle down, to refresh. It was a way to take a deep breath and just and establish contact with his Father in prayer. And the Sabbath helps us do that. Let's go back to Exodus chapter 16 for another principle that we're all familiar with, but it's a good reminder here in Exodus 16. It's the chapter where God miraculously fed Israel with manna and instructed them about gathering manna. And of course, there are instructions here about the Sabbath day. Part of the aspect of remembering the Sabbath is preparing for the Sabbath. I first saw that in action as a freshman at Ambassador College in 1969. Busy campus all week long, very busy, a lot going on everywhere. But Friday afternoon, things began to really just slow down. The equipment all came into transportation and was parked. Meal prep was kept to a minimum. It was paper plates and plastic, utensils, so there would be less cleanup, and everything just slowed down. The whole campus got quiet. Saw that at SEP in Orem, Minnesota, with 500 campers and staff. The same thing Friday afternoon. Things just began to slow down and quiet down, and the whole campus just calmed down. We tried to go into the Sabbath in that frame of mind, preparing for the Sabbath by beginning that slow down process as much as possible. Exodus chapter 16, verse 22. And so it was on the 6th day that they, Israel, gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. Then he said to them, "This is what the Lord has said, tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake today, and boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept until morning." They prepared ahead of time for the Sabbath. They used the time approaching the Sabbath to prepare themselves, to get away from the things they normally would do, to pick up the pace part of the day, and then go into the Sabbath prepared for the Sabbath itself. It's not a long list of do's and don'ts, but an important principle, preparing for the Sabbath, so that we can immerse ourselves more completely in the Sabbath. And I know especially with young children, it's a challenge. It can be harder and more challenging, but we find ways as parents to include our children into understanding the need to relax, and activity calms down some. They don't do the same kinds of activities. Things calm down, and we go into the Sabbath in a more relaxed mode and frame of mind. Verse 24. So they laid it up till morning as Moses commanded, and did not stink, nor were there any worms in it, as there had been before. Then Moses said, "Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will be none." Preparation and being ready for the Sabbath in many different ways. Now let's turn to Isaiah 58. When you think Isaiah 58, what comes to mind that is in Isaiah 58? Well, we know Isaiah 58 a great deal of it is about fasting, but it's also about the Sabbath. And there are some problems that God describes here in Isaiah 58, problems both related to fasting and problems related to the Sabbath. And so God gives instructions about both. What's interesting is we'll see a parallel between fasting as God intended and its side benefits, and observing the Sabbath as God intended and its side benefits. It's important to see the context of verses 13 and 14 about the Sabbath in the context of the whole chapter. So Isaiah 58, verse 1 and 2. Cry aloud, spare not. Lift up your voice like a trumpet. Tell my people their transgression, and the house of Jacob their sins. There were some problems. Yet they seek me daily and delight to know my ways. As a nation that did righteousness, did not forsake the ordinance of their God, they ask of me the ordinances of justice. They take delight in approaching God. So issues of righteousness, of coming to God, of the ordinance of God are being discussed here in this chapter. Verse 3. They say, why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen? There's a problem. Why have we afflicted our souls, and you, God, take no notice? In fact, in the day of your fast, you find pleasure and exploit all your laborers. This verse and the following verses about fasting say basically the same thing that it will say in the last two verses of this chapter about the Sabbath. If one fasts as God intended, there are side benefits from fasting. Likewise, keeping the Sabbath, there are side benefits. Verse 4 and 5. Indeed, you fast for strife and debate and to strike with the fists of wickedness. You will not fast as you do this day to make your voice heard on high. Is it a fast that I have chosen, a day for a man to afflict his soul? Is it to bow down his head like a bulrush and to spread out sackcloth and ashes? Would you call this a fast and an acceptable day to the Lord? In other words, inwardly they were still doing their own will. There was no change in attitude or in their conduct, while outwardly looking as if they had changed, looking as though they were fasting. But God is telling them this pays no dividends spiritually. There are no side benefits from this kind of fast. They missed the real purpose of fasting. Verse 6 and 7. Is this not the fast that I have chosen? To loose the bonds of wickedness. There's a change that is to take place as time goes on in having a relationship with God that includes fasting. To undo the heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, and that you break every yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and that you bring to your house the poor who are cast out? When you see the naked, that you cover him, and hide not yourself from your own flesh. A broader perspective to fasting is given here, a bigger picture of change, a change in conduct and change in attitude. Verse 8 and 9. Then, notice the side benefits. Then your light shall break forth like the morning. It's kind of an aha moment, a change in thinking. Your light shall break forth like the morning. Your healing shall spring forth speedily. Perhaps physically, but also spiritually, mentally, emotionally. Your righteousness shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Protection, guidance from God. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry, and he will say, here I am. If you take away the yoke from your midst, the pointing of the finger and speaking wickedness. Side benefits from fasting, healing. Internally, perhaps problems, things coming to light as you fast and pray. God brings things to mind. We gain an understanding of certain things, and that only fasting will bring at times. When we consider ordaining someone as an elder, we always fast before that. And, sometimes something can come to light. Maybe we should just hold off on this because God has brought something to light. And so this is all part of that relationship with God, that God respects and honors having that kind of relationship that includes fasting. Verse 10, if you extend your soul to the hungry and satisfy the afflicted soul, then your light shall dawn in the darkness, and your darkness shall be as the noonday. That is a clarity of mind, an understanding. Things come to mind that God can give certain wisdom and understanding. The Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your soul in drought. Strengthen your bones. You shall be like a watered garden and like a spring of water whose waters do not fail. Blessings. Those from among you shall build the old waste places. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. And you shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to dwell in. So God guides, satisfies our soul, our life in times of drought or in times of trial. God can be there to help. He said we bear fruit physically and spiritually. Some very positive benefits from having this kind of relationship with God and fasting in the way that he intends. There are many side benefits. Now look at verse 13, because again, verse 13 and 14 need to be viewed in this whole context. The first part of the chapter describes a religious act, fasting. And the closing verses describe a religious act, keeping the Sabbath, and side benefits. Verse 13, what does this mean? If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, turn away your foot from the Sabbath. The opposite, that is, keeping your foot on the Sabbath, means to profane it or to dishonor it. To turn away the foot from the Sabbath means to turn away from doing one's own business and labor and work, as the verse goes on to explain, in order to honor the Sabbath. We don't want to trample on the Sabbath. The Sabbath is holy ground. And the faithful one, described here, is to keep himself on holy ground, not trampling it with his foot. We stay on holy ground by following these instructions about the Sabbath. Several years ago, I was in the Twin Cities for a regional family weekend, got up on stage behind the lectern to give the sermon, and there on the lectern, somebody had placed an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper this way, and it was on the lectern, and on it was the Minnesota Vikings logo, the Viking helmet and the Viking head, and underneath in big, bold, black, all-cap letters was, "You're on holy ground, remove your shoes," which, of course, they knew I was a Packers fan, so, but this was Minnesota Vikings territory, so you're on holy ground, remove your shoes. I had a suspicion of who had put that up there, and I was right. But he was a good friend, and he still is, but I reminded him of that. They considered it holy ground. Well, the Sabbath is holy ground, and that's the point of this, that we don't trample on the Sabbath. If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath. And then it goes on to say, from doing your pleasure on my holy day. Now, the word for pleasure, hepes, H-E-P-E-S, can also be translated business. From doing your business or pleasure on the Sabbath. Either one is proper, is okay. Ultimately, in the English language, it means gratification or diversion or enjoyment of the senses of the mind. In other words, your own business instead of God's business on the Sabbath. The normal things we should be doing on the other 6 days of the week, we don't do on the Sabbath. It goes on to say, from doing your pleasure on my holy days, if you call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord honorable, and shall honor him. We honor God by keeping the Sabbath, not doing your own ways, as opposed again to God's ways. The word your own ways, or ways, derek in Hebrew, D-E-R-E-K, your own enterprise, but the emphasis is on our ways versus God's ways, that we give attention to God. We rest from our regular human activities so we can reflect more on the ways of God. We're busy 6 days of the week. The Sabbath is, of course, not to be that way with the things we would normally do. So the Sabbath is not a burden. I knew a good friend of mine who, for many years, gave sermons and sermonettes about the Sabbath. And when there were changes made, at one point he said, I always felt the Sabbath was a burden. And yet for many years he preached about the Sabbath and keeping God's Sabbath, but he said, I always felt it was a burden. And, that, of course, puzzled me. Why would you go through that effort? Why would you observe it all those years if you believed it was a burden? Well, God doesn't intend for the Sabbath to be a burden, but it frees us to build our relationship with him, taking our mind off of certain things and putting our mind on the ways of God so that we can build our relationship with God. He says it's to be a day of delight, a joy and a delight. We delight in whatever God has for us on this day, in our personal prayer, in our personal Bible study, on the Sabbath, at services, in fellowship, in instruction. We delight in all the things that God has for us. And the end result, verse 14, then you shall delight yourself in the Lord. Do we delight in God, in knowing God? In knowing God as a loving Father, in being able to be his son or daughter? Do we find delight in that? And in our prayers, we tell God how delighted we are to be able to call him Father. We delight ourselves in God. And I will cause you to ride on the high hills of the earth. One translation simply says the heights of the earth, talking about blessings from God. And feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, the mouth of the Eternal has spoken. God has blessings and promises side benefits. These are all metaphors for God's blessings, physically, spiritually, mentally, and emotionally. I want to conclude the sermon by reading from this article, Ancient Wisdom, from Hemisphere magazine. The article begins, "Not so long ago, I was just another harried working mom, rushing through the day with one thought always in mind, why isn't there any time? Then in a moment of divine inspiration, I decided to try an old-fashioned cure for my space-age blues. It's called the Sabbath. And it's a mental health tool that works as well today as it did 3,200 years ago when the Hebrews codified a weekly day of rest as the fourth commandment. Of course, we know it goes all the way back to creation. She's writing from a Orthodox Jewish point of view. The beauty is that it can work for anyone. It has been said that the Sabbath is the Hebrews' greatest gift to humanity. Of course, it's God's gift to humanity. Indeed, no matter what religion you practice or don't practice, a day of rest each week brings rich rewards. Now, if someone told you that there was a way to stop the onslaught of everyday obligations and improve your social life, keep the house clean, revive your tired marriage, elevate spiritual awareness, and improve productivity at work all overnight without cost, you would probably say that that claim was absurd. I certainly did, but I was willing to see if some cosmic miracle cure might really work. And after a year of earnest research, I discovered that adherence to a seemingly arcane set of Sabbath rules yielded a precious gift of time. I admit my secular observances are not those of the Orthodox Jews who engage in elaborate prayers and rituals throughout the Sabbath, uphold special dietary rules, spend many hours studying at a synagogue, or may even avoid switching on electrical devices. Of course, that's not how we would necessarily keep the Sabbath either. Instead, my husband and I tried to honor the meaning of the Sabbath while adapting the practices to our taste, our temperament, and our times. Nonetheless, from sundown Friday night until sundown Saturday night, we symbolically joined the dark-robed Jews of Jerusalem at rest. No cooking, no shopping or paying bills, no pulling weeds or pruning shrubs, no cleaning or repairing the house, not even talking about or thinking about work and the office. The Sabbath day is a day without labor, a time to savor the sweetness of life with a delicious meal and with wine, napping, reading, strolling. My personal life, my professional life, and my family life have all improved, and I plan to go on celebrating the Sabbath. The most powerful and illuminating discovery for me may be the sudden understanding of how an ancient edict can have such a thoroughly modern application. The Sabbath began 2,000 years ago as an answer to the burdens of ceaseless and difficult labor. Well, it began longer than that. At the dawn of a new millennium, our problems aren't all that different. My own quest began at a marriage counselor's office. They were having marriage problems. After 22 fruitful years of marriage, my husband Saul and I found ourselves deadlocked over crises of time management, of growth and change. Our children were beginning to leave the nest. We wanted to have a wonderful adventure with new friends and interests. I wanted to try that myself and with Saul. But we had a lot of responsibilities, including a new business property under construction. We needed to work extra hours to make the project a success. We were caught in a net of squabbling. Just deciding to get some outside help was a sobering step for both of us. The next week, I came across a book, the week after they began this marriage counseling. I came across a book about the Jewish holidays and started reading the chapter describing the Sabbath. Yes, it's a holiday, a special event that occurs not once a year, not a week, but a day, so significant that it is inscribed among the 10 Commandments along with "You shall not murder and you shall not steal." The simple textbook description electrified me. The Sabbath, it says, marks the difference between man and all the other creatures that live in the universe. This day of rest was to be strictly observed in order for humans to cease from the everyday struggle for existence and enjoy life's material and spiritual gifts. At our second and last meeting with the counselor, I suggested to Saul that we try a day of rest, a day set aside from all the others as a way to break out of our rut. He readily agreed, and all that remained was to follow the rules and see what happened. Like so many people of Jewish heritage in the modern United States, we had never really learned what it meant to observe the Sabbath. We knew the outlines. The approach of sundown on Friday was to be heralded with an especially good holiday meal, including the best wine and not one but 2 loaves of the Jewish bread. It's Jewish custom. 2 special loaves of that twisted bread that they make. It's a custom they still have. The house was to be spotless, and all the work was to be completed. And there was more. No lighting of fire, and if we were going to be thorough, no carrying of money, no riding in the car. Of course, we wouldn't necessarily propound everything exactly the way they understood it. What does it all mean? The answer has proven to be an exciting journey. That first Sabbath, I took Friday afternoon off from work to clean the house from top to bottom. If a family with 3 teenagers is going to get a day without work, we should start with everything extra clean. This practice proved to be an instant winner, and I have permanently changed my work week to the benefit of our home life. So it's interesting how her work week, she made it revolve around the Sabbath and found a way to do that. I have permanently changed my work week to the benefit of our home life. I also baked that first week 2 loaves to honor the biblical injunction to have an extra loaf on the Sabbath. The second loaf underscores the day's importance as a day of rest. Along with the bread, I cooked enough stew to last through Saturday, and suddenly a day's worth of cooking and cleanup had disappeared. The rule against lighting a fire or turning on an electric range during the Sabbath was first odd, but suddenly made all the sense in the world. Saul came home from work on Friday afternoon, cleared away a stack of bills before the sun went down. In the last hour before sunset, I thumbed through my briefcase, decided to tie up some loose ends. Since then, both of us have adopted the habit of doubling our pace on Fridays, taking care of little things that are so easy to put off. And what about Saturdays? Well, that first week after rising extra late, Saul and I took our coffee into the backyard, and I absent-mindedly began picking weeds. "Stop! Don't do that," Saul said, thus beginning our continuing explanation of the meaning of work, and more important, the meaning of Judaism. Saul was right to stop me, it turns out. We try now to read every week from a book of biblical commentary as a way to learn the theology. On the Sabbath, our book says, humans should exist in a state of perfect harmony with the natural world, and that means letting the weeds and the lawn grow without interference. We're both passionate gardeners, but working in the garden every spare moment leaves no time to enjoy its beauty and tranquility. We soon gave up shopping on Saturday, and now there is a day when the commercial realm has no hold on our family. Although we hedge on the no driving rule when the car takes us on a spiritual journey. So what do we do with the time we've gained? In addition to sleeping late and enjoying our gardens, Saul and I have started doing things we have long put off. Now, we might not do all the same things. Some of these things we might. Hiking, visiting with friends, enjoying theaters and museums, and reading. What about our children? Daniel is now 18. He's always been resistant to organized religion, but during the last year he has started to attend services with us. Austin, 12, has accepted that he wouldn't be visiting the arcade or playing video games on Saturday. Instead, he relishes the hiking trips. The family Sabbath observance has meant the most to our 16-year-old daughter, Marina. She makes sure she's home for Friday dinner, and her friends have discovered that cool braided bread hot from the oven. And most of all, I look forward to my weekly holiday. As the sun goes down each Friday evening, I take off my wristwatch, and for a night and a day, time stands still. I thought it was an interesting article again, Ancient Wisdom, as far as a perspective on the Sabbath and what it has meant to their family as they understood the Sabbath. It's interesting to see the side benefits that came to them who saw a principle of God and began obeying it, keeping the Sabbath. Again, that statement in Isaiah 58 and verse 14, "Then you shall delight yourself in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride on the high hills of the earth, feed you with the heritage of Jacob, your father. The mouth of the Lord has spoken." There's certainly a physical benefit to the Sabbath. There is certainly a great spiritual benefit to the Sabbath, since it is a tool to help us build our relationship and strengthen our relationship with God. And there are also these mental and emotional benefits as well. And I think we can see how observing the Sabbath, I hope, we can all see how it has made a difference in our lives. I know it's made a dramatic difference in my life when I first began learning about the Sabbath and have been keeping it. And maybe this message today might stimulate a few thoughts about how we might want to improve our Sabbath observance if we need to. Maybe do we need to polish it up a bit in some way or another? Can we polish up our Sabbath observance a little bit if that's needed? Just a little bit. There may be some new ways, some new approaches that we can take that can apply in how we observe the Sabbath as we observe God's holy Sabbath day. Ancient wisdom filled with benefits.